Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Cold War Military Heritage Series speech. Today we have Andreas Linderoth. He works in the Swedish Naval Museum in Karlskrona, Sweden. It's a World Heritage Site. Karlskrona now is still a Navy city, an outstanding example of a late 17th century European planned naval city. Besides the city planning, some city tradition related to Navy is still alive. Today, Andreas will give us a speech about the introduction of the city and the preservation and interpretation in and outside the Swedish Naval Museum. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me present this subject. So I will talk a few minutes here about the military cultural heritage of the Cold War in Karlskrona, Sweden. The most examples will be taken from the museum where I work, but I will also try to complement them with a few examples from outside the museum. And the presentation, as said before, focuses on the Cold War. I could also add that the Naval Museum is a government-financed museum in Sweden with a national mission to preserve and present the naval heritage of Sweden. And it approximately has 120,000 visitors every year, with 50% coming from other countries. And just to know where Karlskrona is located, it's in the southeastern part of Sweden, approximately 5 hours by car from the capital, Stockholm, and has approximately 50,000 inhabitants. And as stated before, it is a naval city and was founded as a naval city. And the Navy is still present in Karlskrona with a naval base and a naval yard. And the city has a lot of military cultural heritage as it has been dominated by the military since its founding. This is how it looks like from above. The city is built on 33 islands, and the island in the center of this image is the main one. And before the city was founded in 1680, this was an uninhabited area of Sweden. So without the Navy, the city would not have existed. You can find the Naval Museum down in the left-hand corner, and you can find the naval base and the Navy Yard in the upper-hand left corner. And as also stated in the introduction, Karlskrona is a very well-preserved naval city, and it owes to the fact that Sweden has not been in war since 1815, and probably also to the fact that the Navy has not been always generously funded for long periods of time. So the Navy has had to use facilities already at hand and not build new structures. And parts of the city are listed on the UNESCO World Heritage List as an example of a very well-preserved early modern naval city. That is mainly the parts of the city dating from the age of sail, that is before 1850. The problem today is that quite a few of important parts of the World Heritage are located within the naval base. That was less of a problem in 1998 when the city was placed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. But it has turned out to be more problematic over the last few years with the mounting military tensions in Europe. So the parts of the World Heritage Site within the Navy base are more or less closed to visitors today. And many important structures and buildings regarding shipbuilding in the age of sail cannot be accessed anymore, or perhaps more accurately, a few times every summer. But that as an introduction, I think we should turn to the Cold War. And for the sake of context, I will start by saying a few words about the Swedish security policy during the Cold War before I turn to the military cultural heritage in and around Karlskrona from that time. If you take a look at the map, you can see the location of Sweden up in the middle, in the upper part of this image, the white marked area together with Finland. Sweden was a non-aligned country during the Cold War, but this wasn't part of any of the military alliances, the NATO or the Warsaw Pact, and wanted to try to stay neutral in the case of war in its vicinity. Sweden is a small country and has not had an offensive war plan since the mid-1850s, and the military has had the task to defend Sweden against foreign military invasion. And during the Cold War, the only possible enemy was the Soviet Union. even if it was not openly stated at the time, Sweden chose to have a rather careful and careful security policy at the time. and didn't want to make any great fuss about that. But it was obvious that the main enemy, or the only enemy at the time, would have been the Soviet Union. And the Navy war plan was to stop a Soviet invasion coming over the Baltic Sea. In the first phase, it was planned that fighter jets and submarines would attack the Soviet ships, and closer to the shoreline, coastal artillery and mines would be present to attack. And also fast attack missile boats would fire missiles from protected positions in the archipelago. So that was the war plans and what the Swedish Navy was trained to do during the Cold War. And this means that a lot of bunkers and other defensive structures were erected in the coastal landscape. During the Second World War, no less than 1,000 concrete bunkers for different purposes were erected along the coasts in the southernmost parts of Sweden. And many of them could be used until the end of the Cold War. It is, however, today pretty hard to discover or understand the intended use of these structures. You need to have the right knowledge. So if you stumble on one of these buildings when you're out wandering in nature, it's not easy to know what the purpose of a certain structure was. So quite a few of them have also been demolished since the end of the Cold War, and they are seldom officially recognized as military cultural heritage, even if there are a few exceptions. On this image to the left, you can find an abandoned naval mine station on an island in the archipelago surrounding Karlskrona. And to the right is a demolished part of a coastal artillery battery, also in the vicinity of a city. Another example is this one. This is a former coastal radar station, abandoned today in a forest close to Karlskrona. It's derelict. There is no use for it, but it just left as it was almost in the late 1990s. And a last example of things that you can find in the landscape when out wandering. This is remnants of a mooring site in the archipelago. It was to be used by the Navy in wartime as a base where a ship could be hidden. And in the structures are those one are framed here in black. And it could have looked like this during wartime, where a ship was moored and it would be hidden through camouflage nets. But the main thing here is that you need to have knowledge to be able to understand the remnants in the landscape. It's not officially acknowledged as military cultural heritage, these sites, but they're just remnants of past activities. There are guidebooks to the military landscape of Blekinge, that is the province where the Karlskrona is located. The authors to these books have tracked the history of different sites, bunkers, and show where to find the remnants and explain their intended use. However, these are private initiatives and not official guides. There are two examples of two sites close to Karlskrona on an island called Aspe that the government has decided to protect for the future as military cultural heritage. One is a coastal artillery battery and one is a coastal radar station. But unfortunately, they are not open to visitors due to economic and safety reasons. It has turned out to be too expensive to adapt these sites to the current building regulations to create emergency exits and make them accessible to disabled persons. The last time they were open to the public was more than 10 years ago, and that was only for a weekend. But as you can see from pictures, they are quite well preserved. This is where the staff could lodge bunk beds, and this is another part of the structure. And this is the coastal radar station with quite a lot of equipment still in the facility. And this is a picture from inside that same facility. But due to the inaccessibility of the remnants in the landscape, I will from now on focus primarily on the Swedish Naval Museum and its exhibitions about the Cold War. And you can see the Naval Museum at this image. It was erected in 1997 and extended in 2014 with the silver building to the right. It's located quite close to the city center, and this island was a restricted military area until the early 90s. So it was open to the general public like the mid 1990s, and then the museum opened a few years later. The main exhibition about the Cold War is called Ytspänning. That would be surface tension in English. And it's about the Cold War in the Baltics in 1979 to 1989. It focuses, as I said, on the last 10 years of the Cold War. And the reason is very much that was a time when the Navy was very much in the attention of the public and the mass media in Sweden. And add to that it was a very tense period of the Cold War when Sweden felt the effects of the Cold War relatively strongly. And Sweden also experienced a great number of possible submarine intrusions from an unknown country, from an unknown foreign country, possibly the Soviet Union. And this created a lot of feelings of anxiety or fear in the Swedish general public at the time. This is the results of public polling about how the Swedish population regarded the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1970s and the 1980s. The last staple to the right, red one, shows that in May 1983, 42% of the people polled thought that the Soviet Union was a direct threat against Sweden, and foreign submarine intrusions were a considerable factor generating this opinion. And there were a great number of reports of submarine intrusions during the 1980s. In this period of time, no less than 4,000 observations of possible submarines were reported to the Navy by the public and the Navy staff. And the image is a booklet that the Navy published to inform the Swedish public on how to identify signs of submarines and report possible sightings. So this was a rather usual phenomenon at the time. So the Navy thought it was necessary to publish a book to help the general public to report possible sightings. And then in 1981, there was a great and very important incident in Swedish naval history in October, when a Soviet submarine ran aground in the archipelago outside Karlskrona. This was a restricted military area. This was an area where foreigners were not allowed, not normally anyway. And this was a major crisis in the relations between Sweden and the Soviet Union. Quite a tense situation where Swedish military was ready to defend Swedish waters if the Soviet Union would try to enter and salvage the submarine. So if the Soviet Union had decided to enter and try to rescue the submarine, there would have been war between Sweden and the Soviet Union. But fortunately, this was not the case. It could be solved diplomatically. And on this map, you can see that it was the submarine stranded rather close to Karlskrona. The two purple dots is where the submarine was placed at the time, and Karlskrona is a bit to the left from those two purple dots. This was quite far into Swedish territorial waters, and here you can see how close to the islands the submarine stranded. Was very, very close to land. But the situation was solved diplomatically after approximately 10 days, and the submarine was allowed to leave Sweden. And the thing that seemed to worry the locals the most was not the intruding submarine, but the announcement by the Swedish Prime Minister on the day the submarine was released. He then made public that it had been equipped with nuclear weapons, and that was a surprise to most of people in Sweden. Very few analysts had thought that had submarines on routine missions in the Baltic Sea with nuclear weapons. And it's still not known why the submarine ended up in Karlskrona and what its mission might have been. The Soviet explanation was a navigational error. And the memory of this incident is still very strong locally and rather well known among the Swedish population. And this is as a background to understand the exhibition about the Cold War in the Naval Museum. You need this background to to be able to comprehend why the exhibition has taken the route it has taken. And this is another example of public press reporting about the naval submarine intrusions in the 1980s, where it stated that we're at war during peacetime. This is the officer in charge of a Navy base in February 1984 that states that the only difference is that if it was war, there would be many more of us doing the work. And you could say that this was rather a warlike situation, as the Navy used live ammunition to try to force the intruding submarines to the surface. And later in the 1980s, also were allowed to use a greater mass of weapons, greater amount of bombs to try to even sink the submarines. So this was a rather peculiar situation for the Swedish Navy during the 1980s. And it should be noted that the submarine hunts were not very successful. The only one that could be identified was the one that voluntarily, so to say, ran aground close to Karlskrona, and there was no confusion about from which country that submarine originated. So how does the Naval Museum deal with the Cold War? Well, the submarine intrusions are still a very hot topic in Sweden, and it's still not possible to really say what happened during that time. It's sometimes questioned if there actually were any submarines at all in Swedish waters at the time, but perhaps the Navy's equipment was not good enough to determine if it was a submarine or a natural phenomenon like fish. But this exhibition therefore focuses on time witnesses, on persons who were active at the time, and let them tell their stories and impressions of the time. This is an attempt to create an understanding of a tense situation these witnesses were a part of. But we also add analysts who put the time witnesses' stories in a wider context. And the testimonies are then also set in the context of the overarching Cold War. There is a focus on the military part of the Cold War, but we also try to show the societal effects of the conflict. And the filmed testimonies of these time witnesses are the centerpiece of exhibition. Here you can see a few images from how the exhibition looks like, and there also a certain focus on how the Cold War affected everyday life in Swedish and Swedish preparations to manage a war's civil effects. The yellow jacket in the center of this image is a protection suit against ABC weapons that the government had decided that every Swede should have access to in case of war. So this is also a general aim of the exhibition to try to give an impression of the tense 1980s when Sweden felt the effects of a Cold War rather intensely. This is the exhibition from another angle. But the main thing is, or are the four corners which feature filmed time witness statements by politicians, naval officers, historians, and political scientists who give their analysis of that time. We will focus on two well-known submarine incidents, the Cold War in general in the 1980s and the end of the Cold War, and focus on the personal experiences, but then add the interpretations by historians and political scientists as a way to show that history is contested and there are many possible interpretations of the Swedish history during the Cold War. And it should also be added that submarine intrusions were not a local phenomenon, but the entire Swedish coastline was affected by submarine hunts from time to time during the 1980s. And these are a few more images from the exhibition where you can see the filmed parts of exhibition where time witnesses give their testimonies. So what else do we have from a Cold War in the Naval Museum? Well, besides of the Cold War exhibition, there is also a part of the museum that deals with submarines, and it houses a Cold War submarine that you can see when it was delivered to the site in 2013. And after the submarine arrived, the building was erected around it. So this is the submarine Neptune to the right from 1979, and also this first Swedish submarine is in that location beside the Cold War submarine. This exhibition focuses rather a lot on technical parts of submarines, but also on the military mission or the military tasks that submarines had to fulfill in case of war. And we also want to show, even this, perhaps it's not very obvious in this picture, that the submarine is a very fearful weapon. And this is what it looks like inside the submarine, but also focus to show life on board. So the visitors can enter the submarine and see what it would have been like to be on board. And this is more focus on life on board. Besides that, we also have another ship from a Cold War that is a fast attack missile boat from the 1980s, which was retired in the late 1990s. This is a time capsule. That means the last crew left all equipment on board. It is not very accessible to the general public. It's only open to visitors during the summer, when the visitors can walk on deck. And a few weeks during the summer, there are also guided tours on board. And the focus is then on life on board. The ship is intact and could still be used, as all equipment is retained, even though no ammunition is stored on board. Now, there is a problem with having museum ships. It's very costly. The maintenance costs the museum quite a lot. The museum's minesweeper is receiving maintenance at the yard at the moment to a cost of equivalent of 1 million euros. And the museum has 3 ships that need this kind of maintenance every 5 years. So I think they are not used enough for actively presenting naval history. They are more at the site as silent witnesses from a time, one could say. So to conclude, how does the Swedish Naval Museum use and present the military cultural heritage? Well, the museum's mission is to present the history of the Swedish Navy. We try to do this by focusing on 3 dimensions: the international context, the national context, and the local context. And one important ambition is to put the human experiences in focus. What was it like to be a part of a Navy in the Cold War, for example, and which effects had the Navy and the Navy's mission on society during the Cold War? When it comes to the Cold War, we try to display how Swedish society was affected by the conflict, militarily mainly, but also politically, and also effects on everyday life. And to conclude, the ambition is also to keep a distance from a Navy and its uses of history. We want to make well-defined choices and our own choices on what stories to tell. We are not a part of a Navy, and we will not be told by the Navy what stories to bring into the museum. We also try to avoid being nationalistic and not fill the museum with heroic tales of Swedes' glorious deeds. That is sometimes a trap that naval museums fall into, but we try to avoid that. And our ambition in general is to present the Swedish naval history and its effects, good and bad, on society, nationally and locally. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Andreas. I think your presentation is very interesting, and actually, I have some questions and a very interesting question about the exhibition in your museum. The first thing is, I think from you mentioned the topic of Cold War. Is it now more and more important in your museum, or it's only part of your museum? Because last time I visited, there are some story about the old ages of Navy. But now I think of course, you may choose more about the Cold War in this speech.
Yeah.
But I want to know how people feedback on this exhibition of the Cold War time compared to the old ages of the Navy.
Yeah, I would say that this is a rather popular exhibition. People tend to find it rather interesting. They stay for quite a long time in this exhibition and listen to the time witnesses and their stories and the stories told in the exhibition. And there has been an ambition for a museum in the last 10 to 15 years to cover more modern history. So the old parts of the history are still a vital part of the museum, but we have tried to add in more modern history. So I would say the Cold War has become more actively remembered in Swedish society during the last, let's say since the Russian attack on Ukraine in 2022. So that has been a revival for the interest in the Cold War and the tensions in Europe that are rather similar to during the Cold War in many ways. So I think it has regained popular interest in the last, let's say, 3, 4, 5 years.
So I heard from our international news that Finland and Sweden now are also affected by the Russia and the Ukraine war. So that become more and more popular for people who wants to understand the Cold War and the relationship between the Sweden and the Russia. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It is. Russia's always been a, let's say, not perhaps an enemy, but always seen as a potential threat to Sweden, and is that even more to today. And that is also, I would say, and what happened in Ukraine is also the main reason why Sweden and Finland decided to join NATO. A few years ago, 2 years ago.
Yes. So my second question is, when choosing the topic and the exhibition about the Cold War event, is there some restriction or difficulty, such as the classified or secret information from the Navy and the military?
Yeah, when it comes to submarine and the submarines and the submarine intrusions, many things are classified, are still classified, and the military does not want to release those documents. So that is also one reason why we chose to work with time witnesses to let people active at the time tell their stories. It's good for exhibition, but it's also a way of dealing with the problem that a lot of things about this period of time is still not known. We cannot tell what actually happened in many ways. So a lot of things regarding submarines are still very, very secret.
Yeah. So you as you show in the last slide, you say that the ambition of the museum is want to also trans to give the information for the different genders and the different ages, such as the children and the women. So how to translate the Cold War history and the weapons to the children and the women? What's the strategy you use?
That's not always easy. That's an aim. I wouldn't say that we always are very successful at doing that, but it is an aim, and we try to. One thing of doing this is I would say that the filmed testimonies are one way. It makes the history come alive in a very, very realistic way, so to say. When you see a person talking to you about that time, it is filmed in that way, but it is as if you sit down and you talk to this person. They tell their story directly to you. You talk directly into the camera, and therefore you get the impression as if they were talking directly. Cold War rather hard to understand. It's a rather blurry concept for many Swedes. We are not very well versed in that period of Swedish history. Schools seldom find the time to deal with modern history. They always get stuck in the mainly to perhaps until the early 1900s when the school ends, so to say. So that's a problem that we have to deal with, and I think this is one way. But it is hard to find information about things like how how were the families of naval officers affected by the activities. We tried to do that. We tried to find information, but it is rather a long time ago. We don't have any diaries. We don't have any notes from relatives of these naval officers. So they have rather not very distinct memories from a time. They can give us a general impression of how it was like to have been a relative of a naval officer at the time, or what the feelings in society were. But yeah, with time, memory fades. That's always a problem.
So my last question is about the ship and the submarine, because
Yeah.
a few years ago in Taiwan, we have to designate a ship, a battleship to cultural heritage.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and then the problem is the cost, as you say, is very
Yeah.
expensive to maintain. So can you give us some example how difficult to maintain a ship, and is this ship in your museum is also listed heritage in your legal system?
Yeah, these ships that we have at the museum are all listed as part of the cultural heritage. So they are owned, so say, by the museum or the government. And we get, as we are a museum, it's a museum financed by the government. We get funding as a part of a museum's budget to try to maintain them. But the money is scarce. It's not enough for these things. So the plan is to maintain them every 5 years. But this minesweeper that I talked about, it had to wait for 8 years before being towed to a yard to be maintained. And when it was there, they found at the yard that it was in a very much worse condition than we thought, because when they removed the paint, they discovered a few holes in the hull. So it was pure luck that the ship didn't sink when it was towed to the yard where it was to be maintained. So it is a problem to find the money to maintain the ships, and you can also discuss if it's worth all of those money to have so many ships, to preserve so many ships in water. We have 3 museum ships at our museum, and the other in Stockholm we have sorry, at the Maritime in Stockholm, they also have 2 or 3 museums museum ships in water. So a lot of money needs to be spent on maintaining them, and I sometimes think that it would perhaps be better to use that money for other purposes in the museum. But that's my personal opinion.
I see. Yeah. So thank you for your your speech and your discussion about the museum, the curation, and the maintain of the ship. That's some problem we always face in these times in the Cold War heritage. I think we always facing the same problem: how to
Yeah.
maintain the site, how to translate information to our audience, and how to maintain a ship is really a big problem, I think.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I think you need quite a lot of money to be able to retain these ships, and I understand the idea of preserving the ships, because they are important testimonies from a certain period of time. But sometimes you have to weigh the costs against the potential gains, so to say. But I don't think the museum will accept any other museum ships in the future. We have enough of them, so to say.
I see. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So